Leave. That was the only word Wyatt Granger said when the stagecoach door swung open and Clara Whitmore stepped down into the Colorado dust. Not with hope in her eyes, not with a nervous smile, not with the eager look of a woman starting over. She stepped down the way a prisoner steps through a gate they don't quite believe is real. And Wyatt saw it immediately. The fear behind the perfect posture, the iron control hiding something broken. He stepped forward and said it again quietly. "You don't have to stay. Not if you don't want to." Clara stopped breathing. If this story already has you, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop the name of your city in the comments below and stay with me until the very end. I want to see just how far this story travels. The telegram had come on a Tuesday. Wyatt Granger read it twice, folded it in half, and set it on the kitchen table beside his cold coffee. Then he sat there for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the wind move through the gaps in the barn walls, and thinking about all the reasons a man like him had no business sending for a wife in the first place. He was 31 years old. He owned 400 acres of Colorado mountain land that was more rock than pasture, a herd of cattle that kept getting smaller, no matter how hard he worked, and a ranch house that had exactly one chair with both armrests still attached. He had no mother to advise him, no brothers to tease him, no neighbors close enough to notice if he didn't come out for 3 days straight. He had his foreman, old Pete Hadley, who smelled like pipe tobacco and creek water, and who communicated mostly in grunts and occasional single syllables. He did not have softness. He did not have warmth. He did not have anything resembling a life worth showing another person. But he had land. And land meant something. Land meant the possibility of something lasting. That was the word he kept coming back to. Lasting. He didn't send for a wife because he was lonely. Men like Wyatt didn't admit to loneliness the way other men couldn't admit to fear. They just walked around with it packed down so deep it stopped feeling like anything at all. He sent for a wife because one brutal winter 2 years back had nearly killed him, and he'd spent 3 days unable to get out of bed from fever with nobody to bring him water. And somewhere around day 2 he'd stared at the ceiling and thought very clearly, this is no kind of life. So he'd written the letter. Sent it east to one of those correspondence agencies. Answered their questions: age, occupation, religious affiliation, temperament, and added one line at the bottom that none of the sample letters suggested: I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a partner willing to build something real. He'd half expected no response at all. He got Clara Whitmore. Her first letter was 3 pages long, written in precise, careful handwriting that left almost no margin space, as though she were afraid of wasting even a 1/4 inch of paper. She didn't describe herself in flattering terms. She didn't talk about her cooking, or her needlework, or her pleasant disposition. She said she was 26. She said she had worked since she was 14. She said she was not afraid of hard work, difficult weather, or difficult people. And she said one thing that stopped Wyatt cold. I am not looking for rescue. I am looking for fair ground. He'd written back the same day. 6 months of letters followed. They were careful letters, factual, respectful, neither of them reaching too far across the distance. She told him about her work in New York. He told her about the ranch. They did not discuss feelings. They discussed practicalities, what the winters were like, whether she could ride a horse, what his expectations were for a working partnership, what hers were in return. He thought he had a reasonable picture of who she was. He was completely wrong. The stagecoach from Denver pulled into Silver Creek on a Thursday afternoon in July of 1886, and half the town came out to watch because Silver Creek was the kind of town where a mail-order bride arriving was the most interesting thing to happen since the Hendersons' bull got loose and wandered into the post office. Wyatt stood apart from the crowd. He held his hat in both hands, and he watched the coach door open, and he waited. The first person out was a heavy-set man in a business suit carrying a leather satchel. The second was a young mother with 2 small children. The third was a traveling salesman Wyatt recognized from his last trip to Denver. And then Clara Whitmore stepped down. The first thing Wyatt noticed was that she was smaller than he'd imagined. The second thing he noticed was the coat, a worn gray wool coat buttoned all the way to the throat, despite the July heat, that had the rest of the crowd fanning themselves with their hats and handkerchiefs. The third thing he noticed was what she was holding, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen twine pressed flat against her body with both arms, the way you'd hold something you were terrified of losing. She stepped down without assistance, without looking around at the crowd, without any of the bright-eyed nervousness Wyatt had expected. She set her feet on the ground and stood perfectly still for just a moment, and in that moment, Wyatt saw something that hit him like a fist to the chest. She was scanning for exits, not obviously, not in any way that most people would have caught, but Wyatt had spent years reading cattle, reading weather, reading the body language of things that were afraid, and what he saw in Clara Whitmore's face in that first unguarded second was not hope. It was a woman calculating exactly how fast she could run if she needed to. He stepped forward before he'd made any conscious decision to move. "Miss Whitmore?" She turned, and her expression locked into something careful and composed so fast it was almost frightening. "Mr. Granger?" Her voice was steady, firm. "I apologize for any delay. The connection in Denver was—" "You don't have to explain," he said. "How was the journey?" "Long." A single word. Then, "Thank you for meeting me." The crowd was watching. Wyatt could feel it. The sideways glances, the whispered commentary, the particular hungry attention that small towns gave to anything new. Mrs. Fenwick from the Mercantile was already leaning toward her neighbor with something clearly forming behind her lips. Wyatt turned his back on all of it. "My wagon's this way," he said. "I'll get your trunk." "I don't have a trunk." He looked back at her. "Beg pardon? I have a traveling bag." She lifted a small battered carpet bag with her free hand, the one that wasn't holding the wrapped package. "This is everything." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "All right," and led her toward the wagon. They were 2 miles out of Silver Creek when he said it. It wasn't planned. It came out of him the way things came out of Wyatt, without announcement, without ceremony, straight from whatever quiet place inside him had been working on the problem since the moment she stepped off that coach. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it as a real question, not a test, not politeness." Clara had been sitting beside him on the wagon bench, her package in her lap, her eyes on the mountain ridge ahead. She didn't turn her head, but something in her posture shifted the same way a horse's ears swivel toward a sound it hasn't classified yet. "All right," she said. "Do you want to be here?" Silence. The wagon wheels rolled over a rough patch of road, and both of them absorbed the jolt without comment. "That's a strange question," she said finally. "Maybe, but I mean it straight. You came a long way. You wrote letters for 6 months. You got on a train." He paused. "None of that tells me whether you actually want to be here or whether you're here because it was the best option you had left." She turned her head and looked at him then. He kept his eyes on the horses, but he felt the weight of her attention, the way you feel the sun come out from behind a cloud. "What would you do," she said slowly, "if I said it was the second thing?" "I'd drive you back to town," he said. "Put you up at the hotel for a night and wire you enough money for a train ticket wherever you want to go." Another long silence. Longer this time. "You'd do that?" "Yes." "Why?" Wyatt finally glanced at her. Her expression wasn't soft. It was stunned in the careful, controlled way of someone who had learned that stunned was dangerous. Like she was checking the feeling for traps. "Because I've got enough problems on this ranch without adding a person who doesn't want to be there," he said. "And because that doesn't seem like much of a life for either one of us." Clara looked back at the road ahead. "I don't know yet," she said. "Whether I want to be here, I think—" She stopped. Started again. "I think I want to find out." Wyatt nodded. "That's fair enough," he said. And they didn't speak again until the ranch came into view. The wedding happened the next morning in the small wooden church at the edge of Silver Creek, performed by Pastor Hollis, witnessed by Pete Hadley and the pastor's wife, and concluded in under 15 minutes. There were no flowers. There was no celebration. Wyatt signed the papers with his left hand because his right was still bandaged from a fence repair 3 days prior. Clara signed with her name in that same precise margin-filling handwriting from her letters, and when it was done, she looked at the document for a moment, just a moment, with an expression that Wyatt couldn't read. Then she folded her hands in her lap and said, "Thank you, Pastor." And that was that. They were married. In those first 2 weeks, Wyatt learned the geography of Clara Whitmore, the way you learn unfamiliar land slowly by what you find where you don't expect it. She was up before him every morning. He was an early riser. He'd never met anyone who beat him to the kitchen. But Clara was already there, coffee already on moving through his kitchen, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been learning spaces all her life. She didn't ask where things were kept. She found them. She worked harder than he'd expected. She didn't say so, didn't announce it, just quietly did more than anyone had asked her to. The garden that had been producing half what it should suddenly started producing properly. The root cellar got reorganized in a way that made winter storage make more sense. She repaired 2 of the kitchen chairs with nothing but twine and a piece of scrap wood she found in the barn, and didn't mention it until Wyatt sat in one and looked surprised. "The joint was loose," she said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "It would have broken within the month." "How'd you know how to fix it?" "I've fixed worse." He believed her. But there was a geography to Clara that confused him. An interior landscape he couldn't map no matter how carefully he observed. She startled at raised voices, not dramatically, just a small involuntary flinch so fast and so well controlled that if you weren't watching for it, you'd never see it. When Pete Hadley came in from the barn one afternoon, shouting about a broken wagon axle in his booming, "Nothing's wrong, I'm just loud." "Way." Clara's hand went white around the handle of the pot she was holding. She recovered in half a second. But Wyatt saw it. She apologized constantly. For things that weren't her fault, for things that weren't problems, for things that didn't need apologizing for at all. She apologized for asking a question. She apologized for taking the last of the soap from the shelf. She apologized for the weather being bad, as if she had somehow caused it. "You don't have to do that," Wyatt said one evening when she'd apologized twice in 10 minutes for a supper. That was, he was not exaggerating, the best food he'd eaten in years. "Do what?" "Apologize. Not to me. Not for things like this." She looked at him with a careful expression. "I don't follow." "Yes, you do," he said. She said nothing, but she didn't apologize again that night. She barely ate. He noticed it at the second supper and was certain of it by the end of the first week. She served generous portions to him and to Pete when he ate with them, and she put small amounts on her own plate and ate half of those. When Wyatt pushed the bread plate toward her, she thanked him and tore off a piece, and ate it with the focused attention of someone reminding themselves that food was a normal thing to eat. "Clara," he said one evening very quietly, so Pete couldn't hear from the other room. When did you last eat a full meal?" She looked up from her plate. Something crossed her face. Not embarrassment exactly. More like surprise that he'd noticed. "I eat fine," she said. "You eat like someone who spent a long time not being sure the food would keep coming." Her fork went still. For a moment the kitchen was completely silent except for the fire. "That's a perceptive thing to say," she said finally. "I'm not perceptive," he said. "I just watch." She picked up her fork. Then she put it back down. Then she said quietly, looking at the table, "My parents died when I was 14. After that, whether or not there was food depended on whether or not I had worked enough that day to earn it." A pause. Old habits. Wyatt got up from the table. He went to the pantry, and he came back with half a loaf of bread, a piece of salt pork, 2 hard-boiled eggs from that morning, and the jar of preserved peaches that Pete had been eyeing for a week. He set them all on the table in front of her. "That's tomorrow's breakfast," she said. "Tomorrow I'll make more," he said. She looked at the food for a moment. Then she looked at him. and whatever she was looking for in his face, she seemed to find it because she picked up an egg and she ate it without apologizing once. Tag. The package stayed on the shelf in her room. Wyatt noticed it the morning after she arrived, set carefully in the corner of the shelf above the small wooden dresser, wrapped in its brown paper, tied with its kitchen twine undisturbed. A week passed. 2 weeks. It never moved. She didn't open it, didn't take it down, didn't talk about it. He did not ask. He was a man who understood that there were things people needed to carry in their own time, and prying into them before they were ready was a good way to destroy any chance of trust. He'd learned that with horses, and he'd found it was just as true with people. But he thought about it. And he thought about it more on the morning she came to him about the black stallion. The horse had arrived 6 weeks before Clara, a gift Wyatt had never asked for from his neighbor Harrison Webb, whose ranch was 12 miles east. Webb had inherited the horse from a buyer who'd given up on him entirely. The animal was 3 years old, 17 hands of solid black muscle, and completely spectacularly dangerous. He had broken 2 handlers' arms, put a third man in the creek from 15 feet away, and systematically destroyed every attempt to work with him. Wyatt had been trying to figure out what to do with him ever since. He couldn't be ridden. He couldn't be worked. He was too valuable to put down and too dangerous to keep. The black one, Clara said, appearing at the barn door one afternoon. In the far pen. Wyatt was repairing a harness. He looked up. What about him? He's not dangerous, she said. He's afraid. Wyatt set the harness down. He put Webb's best handler in a sling. That handler probably came at him hard, she said. Someone's been rough with that horse. You can see it in how he moves. He leads with his shoulder when he's trying to get space. That's not aggression. That's defensive. He studied her. She was looking past him into the barn, and her expression was different from any expression he'd seen on her face before. Focused, certain, completely without the careful apology she usually wore like a second coat. You know horses, he said. I know that one, she said simply. Can I go near him? Clara, he's put 3 men down. She looked at him then, and her voice was quiet and utterly flat. I know. Can I go near him? He should have said no. Every sensible bone in him said no. The horse was unpredictable, and she was small, and they'd been married 3 weeks, and he had no idea what kind of funeral he'd have to explain to the pastor if this went wrong. He said, I'll be right behind you. She went to the gate of the far pen. She didn't open it. She just stood there, her hands loose at her sides, and she waited. The stallion was at the far end, doing what he always did, moving in tight, agitated circles, head high, tension in every line of him. He registered her presence. His head came around, his nostrils flared. Wyatt's hand was on the gate latch. Clara didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She didn't do anything except stand there with her hands at her sides and wait with a patience that was so complete and so quiet, it was almost hard to look at, like watching something private, something that wasn't meant for him. The stallion stopped circling. He took 1 step toward her, then another. Then he was crossing the pen in a straight line, and Wyatt's heart had completely stopped, and the horse walked up to the gate and put his nose directly into Clara's open palms, and let out a long, shuddering exhale that Wyatt had never heard from that animal before. Clara closed her fingers gently around the horse's muzzle. There you are, she said softly. There you are. Nobody's going to be rough with you anymore. Wyatt stood completely still. He had seen a lot of things in his years on this land. He had seen a lot of things that didn't have clean explanations, but he had never seen anything like that. After a long moment, he said, What did you just do? Clara looked over her shoulder at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his ranch, she didn't look afraid. She didn't look careful. She didn't look like a woman managing herself. She looked like herself. I don't know exactly, she said. I hear them, what they're feeling. I always have. A pause. Most people think it's strange. Most people, Wyatt said quietly, have never seen what I just saw. She turned back to the horse. Her expression went careful again, in that way it always did when something felt too exposed, too visible. "It doesn't always work," she said. "And it's not magic. It's just listening. Really listening. Most animals are afraid because nobody ever bothered to listen to what frightened them." Wyatt looked at his wife, standing with both hands cradling the face of a horse that had hospitalized 3 grown men. He thought about a woman who ate half a meal and apologized for asking questions and flinched at raised voices and still somehow had enough left inside her to walk straight at something terrifying and call it by its real name. He thought, "Who did this to you?" And then he thought, "Who did this to her?" The answer started coming 3 days later, not from Clara, but from a letter. It arrived with the weekly mail delivery addressed not to Wyatt but to Clara Whitmore. Not Clara Granger, not Mrs. Granger, but Clara Whitmore, her former name written in handwriting that was heavy and precise, and somehow managed to feel aggressive even in ink. Clara took the letter from Pete, who handed it over without comment, and she read the first 3 lines, and then she folded it in half with a crease sharp enough to cut paper, and she put it in her apron pocket and didn't mention it. Wyatt was watching from the other side of the yard. He didn't say a word. But that night when she came to supper, she ate even less than usual, and 3 times he caught her looking at the window, rather than her food, with an expression he hadn't seen before. Something tightly wound, something braced. He waited until Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet. "You going to tell me," he said, not making it a question exactly, "who wrote you that letter?" Clara's hands stilled around her coffee cup. "It's not your concern," she said. "You're my wife," he said, not harshly, just plainly. "That doesn't make everything my concern yours." She looked up. Her eyes were steady. "I've managed this before. I can manage it now." "Clara." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking because I think you can't manage. I'm asking because whatever it is has you looking at the door all through supper, and I'd rather know what we're dealing with than find out when it's already here." She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Long enough that he could feel the weight of everything she was deciding. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the folded letter and set it on the table between them. Wyatt picked it up and read it. It was short, barely half a page. It said that the writer was traveling west on business, that Silver Creek was among his planned stops, and that he hoped Miss Whitmore had settled her current situation satisfactorily, because he intended at his earliest convenience to discuss it with her personally. The name at the bottom was Edgar Calloway. "Who is he?" Wyatt asked, keeping his voice even. Clara looked at her coffee. "A man from New York. A railroad investor. He had business dealings that touched the stables where I worked." She paused. "He decided I was something he wanted. When I disagreed with that, he decided he would find other ways to make me agree." "What kind of other ways?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was very controlled. "He told my employer I was unstable, that I had been caught stealing, that the way I worked with horses was suspicious, possibly dangerous." A breath. "I lost 3 positions in 8 months. Each time I found something new, a letter would arrive ahead of me. He was patient about it. He thought eventually I would—" She stopped. "You'd have no choice," Wyatt said. "Yes. And the correspondence agency. He doesn't know I used one, or he didn't." She looked up. "He does now, apparently." Wyatt set the letter back on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his wife, at the rigid set of her shoulders, at the way she was waiting for his response with a careful, controlled stillness that he recognized now as the particular stillness of someone who had learned that other people's anger could arrive without warning. "All right," he said. "All right." She looked cautious. "All right, we know he's coming. That's useful." He stood up and took his coffee to the window. "How long before he gets to Silver Creek?" A long silence from behind him. Then very quietly, You're not going to tell me to handle it myself." He turned. "Why would I do that?" "Because it's my problem." "You're my wife," he said again. "And this is my ranch. Whatever walks onto my land is my problem too." He paused. "I don't say that to take it from you. I say it because you shouldn't have to stand in front of that man alone." Clara looked at him across the kitchen with an expression he couldn't entirely name. Something that was fighting itself. Something uncertain and strange and fragile at the edges. "I've been standing in front of him alone for 3 years," she said. "I know," Wyatt said. "And you survived it. You're stronger than most people I've ever met." He looked at her steadily. "But you don't have to anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the horses shifted in the barn. And in the far pen, the black stallion made one low sound in the dark. Clara reached up and touched the chain at her throat, a small, unconscious gesture. Her eyes went to the window, and then came back to him. "He's not going to like finding me here," she said. "With a husband. With land." "No," Wyatt agreed. "He's not. He'll make trouble for you, for the ranch. He has money and connections, and he doesn't stop when he decides he wants something." Wyatt picked up his coffee. "I've had trouble before. Not like this." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "What's in the package, Clara?" She went still. "The one on your shelf," he said. "The one you carried off the stage." For a long time she didn't answer. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the window glass. And Wyatt waited the way she'd taught him to wait without meaning to, with patience, with space, with both hands open. "It's from my mother," she said finally. "She gave it to me the week before she died. She said—" Her voice caught once, and she mastered it. "She said to open it when I found somewhere safe." She looked up. "I've been carrying it for 12 years. I haven't found anywhere safe yet." Wyatt set down his coffee. He walked to the door of the kitchen, and he stopped, and he said without turning around, "This ranch isn't perfect. It's half falling apart, and it owes more than it should, and the winters will try to kill you every single year." A pause. "But nobody will reach you here without coming through me first." He went outside, and Clara sat alone in the kitchen, her hands around her cooling cup, looking at the window and the dark mountains beyond, and thinking about a locked package on a shelf and a man who had just said the most terrifying and wonderful thing anyone had ever said to her. That she was somewhere safe. That she could stay. She opened the package that night. Wyatt was still outside when she took it down from the shelf. Her hands were steadier than she expected. 12 years of carrying a thing had a way of making the moment you finally stopped feel both enormous and strangely ordinary, the way a held breath feels when you finally let it go. The twine came loose easily. The brown paper unfolded in 3 careful layers, the way her mother had always wrapped things as though presentation was a form of love. Inside was a small leather journal, worn soft at the corners. And tucked inside the cover, a folded note in her mother's handwriting, faded now to pale brown ink on yellowed paper. "Clara, you have always heard what others cannot. Do not let the world convince you that what you hear is wrong. It is your inheritance from me and from her mother before me and from hers before that. Every woman in this family has carried it quietly because the world was not ready. Perhaps one day it will be. Until then, write it down. Keep it. It is yours, and no one can take it unless you let them." Clara sat with the journal open in her lap for a long time. She didn't cry. She had cried for her mother a long time ago, and there was nothing left of that particular grief but a kind of hollow quiet that lived in her chest and sometimes made it hard to breathe deeply. What she felt now was something different, something that didn't have a clean name. She thought about the word her mother had used. Inheritance. Not a curse. Not a strangeness. Not the thing that men with money and cruelty had spent years telling her it was. An inheritance. She was still sitting there when Wyatt came back inside. He saw the open package on the table. He saw her face. He said nothing, just went to the stove, refilled his coffee, and sat down across from her with the quiet patience that she had decided somewhere in the last 4 weeks was the most remarkable thing about him. "My mother called it listening," Clara said without preamble. "She said every woman in our family had it. The ability to hear what animals were feeling. Not words, not like that. More like the shape of their fear, the weight of it. She looked down at the journal. She said the world wasn't ready for it. She wasn't wrong, Wyatt said. No. Clara ran her thumb across the cover. Men like Edgar Calloway aren't afraid of it because it's dangerous. They're afraid of it because they can't own it. She looked up. He tried very hard to own it. He wanted to put me in his house and bring in his wealthy friends and show them what his wife could do with horses. A pause. Like a trick. And when you said no, when I said no, he decided if he couldn't have it, nobody would. Her voice stayed level. He's very good at being patient. Very good at making things look like your fault. By the time he was done, I had 3 former employers willing to say in writing that I was unstable, deceitful, and possibly dangerous. She set the journal on the table. One of them had been kind to me for 2 years before Edgar got to him. I still don't know what he offered. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. How'd you find the agency? He asked. A woman I knew, another stable hand, Mary Gaines. She'd left New York the same way 2 years before. She wrote me once just a short letter, just to say she was alive, and the air was cleaner, and nobody was watching her anymore. Clara almost smiled. I kept that letter for a year before I used it. Mary Gaines, Wyatt repeated. Where'd she land? Wyoming somewhere. She didn't say exactly. Clara looked at him. Why? Because the world is smaller than people think, he said, and sometimes that's a useful thing. He stood, carried his cup to the basin. Get some sleep. We've got Harrison Webb coming tomorrow to look at the stallion. She blinked. You told him about what I did. I told him the horse was making progress. He'll see the rest himself. Wyatt paused at the doorway. Clara, that journal. It belongs on your shelf. Not in your pocket, not under your mattress. On your shelf. She looked at him. This is your home, he said. Act like it. He went to bed, and Clara sat for a while longer in the kitchen with the journal open on the table and the fire burning low, and she thought that she had been wrong about Wyatt Granger, in the way you're wrong about terrain when you're reading a map drawn by someone who's never walked the land, not wrong about the shape of it, but wrong about the feel of it under your feet. She'd expected utility. She'd expected a transaction. She had not expected a man who noticed how much she ate. Why? Harrison Webb arrived the next morning with 2 ranch hands and a skepticism he wore as openly as his hat. He was a big man, red-faced, good-natured, in the loud way of men who had never needed to be careful about their size, and he stood at the fence of the far pen, with his arms crossed, and his expression already forming toward polite disappointment. Wyatt, he said, I appreciate the effort, but that animal has wasted 6 months of 3 different men's time, and if you're about to tell me a month on your ranch fixed what? He stopped talking. The black stallion was walking toward Clara, not charging, not shying, walking with a loose and quiet movement that Harrison Webb had never in his life seen from that horse crossing the pen and dropping his head directly into Clara's hands like he was coming home. Harrison Webb's mouth was open. That's... He stopped. How in the... He stopped again. He looked at Wyatt. Who is she? My wife, Wyatt said. Your wife did that? Yes. Webb turned back to the pen. Clara was speaking to the horse in a low, steady voice. Her hands moving slowly along the bridge of his nose, and the stallion was standing with every muscle relaxed, his eyes half closed, completely transformed from the animal that had put 3 men on the ground. I've had horses 30 years, Webb said quietly. I've never seen anything like that. No, Wyatt agreed. You haven't. Webb cleared his throat. Could she? Is that something she could do with others? I've got a mare that came off a bad transport, won't let anyone near her. Lost 2 saddle horses last spring that just couldn't be brought around. If your wife could, you'd have to ask her, Wyatt said. Webb looked at him, then looked at Clara, then looked back at Wyatt. Wyatt, that woman is going to be the most talked about person in this county inside of a month. She already is. Pete Hadley said from behind them, without looking up from the fence post he was repairing. Mieczukicz. Webb wasn't wrong. It started quietly. A word here, a word there. The way things moved through Silver Creek. A comment at the feed store, a question after Sunday service, someone's brother mentioning it to someone else's husband over a card game at the saloon. By the third week, ranchers were driving horses to Wyatt's property. Not a flood. Not immediately. 2 or 3 a week at first, men who arrived with a studied casualness that didn't quite cover how much they needed the help leading animals that were frightened or damaged or dangerous in ways that normal methods hadn't touched. They shook Wyatt's hand and talked about prices and fencing and cattle markets, and then their eyes drifted to where Clara was working and stayed there. She charged fairly. Not cheaply, she had learned painfully the specific danger of undervaluing yourself, but fairly. She didn't promise what she couldn't deliver. She told men honestly when an animal's fear was too old and too deep to fully reach, and she told them honestly when it wasn't. And the difference between those two things was something she seemed to know with a certainty that nobody could explain, and nobody tried to argue with after they'd watched her work. The money was real. It came in steadily enough to matter. But what Wyatt noticed more than the money was what it did to Clara. She straightened. There was no other word for it. Not that she'd been stooped, she'd always held herself with careful composure, but there was something in her spine that changed, something that had been braced against a blow that slowly stopped waiting for the blow to come. She asked questions without apologizing first. She made decisions about the ranch without checking each one twice against his face to make sure he wasn't angry. She laughed once clearly and without self-consciousness at something Pete said, and then looked briefly startled by the sound of it, as if she'd forgotten she could do that. Wyatt watched all of it. He was careful about what he did with what he felt. He had not married Clara for love. He had married her for partnership and practicality, and because her letters had suggested a steadiness that he respected. What he felt now was something he hadn't planned, for something that showed up quietly and occupied space without announcing itself the way the best things usually do. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. Kig. The afternoon, everything changed. Started with a child. Margaret Hollis, 9 years old, daughter of the pastor, absolutely fearless in the particular way of children who have not yet learned to connect their actions to their consequences, had gotten it into her head that she wanted to pet the black stallion. Wyatt was across the yard when he heard the commotion. He was moving before he fully understood what he was hearing: a child's voice, high and indignant, and then a crash, and then Clara's voice, sharp and immediate. "Don't run. Stand still. Margaret, stand still." He came around the corner of the barn to find Margaret Hollis backed against the fence of the far pen. The stallion rearing above her, not in a killing fury, but in the wild cornered panic of an animal that had been startled and was reacting from somewhere deep and old and scared. And Clara was already inside the pen, already between the child and the horse, both arms out. Her voice dropping from sharp to low to something barely above a murmur. "Hey," she said. "Hey, it's me. It's just me. Nobody's hurting you." Wyatt's hand was on the gate. Clara looked back at him over her shoulder just for a second. "Don't," she said, quiet, certain. "Stay there." He stayed. The stallion's front hooves came down. He shook his head once hard, his breath coming in explosive snorts. Clara didn't move. She let him have the air, let him have the noise, let him burn through the panic at his own speed. And she stood between the animal and the child, and she didn't flinch once. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes that felt longer than most days Wyatt could remember. When it was over, when the stallion had settled and dropped his head, and Clara had backed herself and Margaret slowly and calmly to the gate, Margaret Hollis burst into tears from sheer delayed terror, and Clara crouched down to the girl's level and held her by both shoulders and said very firmly, "You're all right. He was scared. You scared him." A pause. "And you are never to go in that pen alone again. Do you understand me?" Margaret, sobbing, nodded. "Say it." I understand." "Good." Clara stood keeping one hand on the girl's shoulder. She looked up at Wyatt. He could see now that her hands were trembling slightly, just slightly, the aftermath of adrenaline controlled for long enough that the body waited until it was safe to shake. "She's fine," Clara said. "She got in through the lower rail." "I see that." He looked at his wife. "You all right?" "Yes." She said it without hesitation, which meant it was mostly true. "Clara?" "I said yes, Wyatt." He nodded. He looked at Margaret Hollis and said in the measured tone of a man who was choosing every word, "I'm going to walk you home to your father." Margaret, recognizing the specific gravity of that sentence, started crying harder. Pastor Hollis heard the story with his hands folded and his face going progressively paler, and when it was done he said, "Mrs. Granger, I cannot express—" "She's fine," Clara said. "No harm done." A pause. "Though it might be worth a conversation with her about gate latches." Hollis looked at Clara with an expression that shifted into something Wyatt hadn't seen directed at his wife before: straightforward, uncomplicated admiration. "Mrs. Granger," he said, "that horse has frightened grown men from 3 counties. What you did—" "I know that animal," Clara said. "I knew he wasn't going to hurt her, not if I got between them fast enough." "Still," Hollis said. He looked at Wyatt. "You have a remarkable wife, Wyatt." Wyatt looked at Clara. "Yes," he said. "I do." Clara looked at her hands. She didn't say anything. But when they were walking back to the wagon and the late afternoon had gone the color of copper on the mountains, she said quietly and without looking at him, "Nobody's ever put it that way before." "What way?" "Like it was worth something." She kept her eyes on the road. "What I do with them. It's always been strange, unsettling. Something to be managed. Nobody ever called it remarkable." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Then, "They were wrong." Clara made a small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, and it wasn't quite not one. "You're very certain about things," she said, "for someone who says he's not perceptive." "I'm not perceptive," he said. "I just watch." "You say that a lot." "It keeps being true." She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it from the corner of his eye, the way you catch the edge of something bright carefully so you don't startle it. It was Pete Hadley who brought the news about Edgar Calloway, and he brought it with the delivery style he used for everything: flat factual, without any editorial commentary, in the same tone he'd used to report a broken fence or a dry well. "Fella asking about the ranch in town," he said, dropping it into the middle of supper the same way you'd drop a stone into a still pond. Stranger, well-dressed, asking Gus at the feed store how long the Grangers had been married, whether there'd been a woman here before, what the wife looked like. He picked up his fork. Gus told him to mind his own affairs, and he smiled and left. Clara's fork had not moved. Wyatt looked at her across the table. "Describe him," Clara said. Pete described him. The silence that followed was very specific. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of a woman who had been expecting something and had hoped she was wrong and wasn't. "He's early," she said. The letter said, "Men like that," Wyatt said, "don't hold to what they say in letters." She set her fork down. Her face had gone into the controlled, managed expression he hadn't seen in weeks, the one she'd worn when she stepped off the stage, the one that meant she was calculating. She was afraid she was not going to let anyone see it. He hated that expression. Not because it was weak, because it wasn't. It was the opposite of weak. It was what strength looked like on a person who'd spent years needing to survive, but because she shouldn't need it anymore, and the fact that she did meant something was coming that was going to try to take everything she'd started to trust. "All right," Wyatt said. He pushed his plate aside and put his hands flat on the table. "Here's what we do." Clara looked at him. "Nothing," he said. "Wyatt." "Not yet. He's asking questions. Let him ask them. The answers people give him will tell us more about this town than anything else." He looked at her steadily. "And the answers they give will tell him something about us." "They'll tell him I'm here," she said. "He already knows that. They'll tell him you're the woman who stood in front of a rearing stallion to protect a child. They'll tell him you're the woman that half the ranches in this county are bringing their damaged horses to. They'll tell him—" Wyatt paused. "They'll tell him you're not what he told people you were." Clara stared at him. "That's your defense," he said. "Not hiding, not running. Being exactly who you already are in a place where people can see it." He held her gaze. "He spent 3 years making people believe a story about you. You've been here less than 3 months, and already the story is different. Let him come. Let him see what he's walking into." For a long moment, she said nothing. Pete Hadley, with the characteristic timing of a man who had worked for Wyatt for 11 years, said, "Biscuit," and offered the basket across the table, and somehow that broke the tension in the room just enough. Clara reached over and took a biscuit. "You're very certain," she said again to Wyatt. "I'm certain about some things," he said. She broke the biscuit in half. "What if he's talked to people already? What if by the time he actually—" "Clara." Wyatt's voice was quiet. "Have you talked to Margaret Hollis's father? Have you talked to Harrison Webb? Have you talked to the 6 men who drove horses out here this month?" She said nothing. "Then talk to them," he said. "Before Calloway does." It was the most direct thing he'd ever said to her, and she sat with it for a moment, turning the biscuit over in her hands. "You want me to tell them about him?" she said slowly. "I want you to let them know who you are before someone else tells them who to think you are." He leaned forward slightly. "Your story is better than his. You just have to be willing to say it out loud." Clara looked down at the table, then she looked up. I've never told anyone, the full of it, what he did." "I know. It's not—" She stopped. "People don't always believe women when—" "No," he said. "They don't. Always." He held her gaze. "But you have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "You're already here," Wyatt said. "Already working. Already someone they've watched do something with their own eyes." He sat back. "He's going to come in from outside with a story. You're already on the inside with a life. Those are very different things." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You planned this." "No," Wyatt said honestly. "I didn't plan anything, but I do think it's true." She put the biscuit down. She picked up her coffee. She looked at Wyatt Granger across the table, at the man who noticed how much she ate, who drove her away from the stage before she'd said yes, who'd stood at the gate with his hand on the latch while she stood between a horse and a child, and trusted her to know what she was doing. She said, "I'm going to need you there, when I talk to them." "I know," he said, "not to speak for me, just to be there," he said. "I know." She nodded once. It was small, but it was the kind of nod that meant something that came from somewhere real. "Wyatt." Her voice dropped. "What if he's already said things? What if there are people in this town who heard something from him and are deciding right now what to believe?" Wyatt considered this. "Then we find out sooner rather than later," he said. "And we find out who in this town is worth knowing." Outside, the wind had come up across the mountains, the kind of night wind that rattled the window frames and put the horses moving in their stalls restless and alert. And somewhere in Silver Creek, in a hotel room or a saloon over a whiskey or a ledger book, a man named Edgar Calloway was already building something designed to destroy what Clara Granger had spent 3 months starting to build. What he hadn't counted on was what those 3 months had built in return. And what he absolutely had not counted on was the woman who walked into a pen with a rearing stallion and didn't blink. Because that woman, the one who was starting slowly and carefully and with enormous effort to believe she was somewhere safe, was not the same woman he'd spent 3 years dismantling in New York. She'd been reassembled here in a different shape entirely. And Wyatt Granger's hand was steady on the gate. She started with Harrison Webb, not because he was the easiest. He wasn't particularly. Webb was a practical man who formed opinions slowly and held them hard, the kind of rancher who had seen enough of the world to be cautious about stories told out of nowhere. But he was also the first person in Silver Creek who had seen what Clara could do, and that mattered. What people see with their own eyes is a different kind of knowing than what they're told, and Clara had understood since she was a girl that the best defense against someone else's version of your story was to make sure people already had their own. She drove out to Webb's ranch on a Tuesday morning without telling Wyatt where she was going. Not because she was hiding it, she left a note on the kitchen table, but because this was hers to do, and she needed to do it alone. And she knew if Wyatt came along, she would keep looking at his face to see if she was saying it right instead of just saying it. Webb met her at the fence. He had the look of a man who was trying to figure out if there was a problem he hadn't heard about yet. "Mrs. Granger," he said, "everything all right with the stallion?" "The stallion's fine," she said. "Mr. Webb, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before someone else tells you a different version of it." Webb went still. Not defensively, just attentively, the way a good stockman goes still when something's about to require his full attention. "There's a man coming to Silver Creek," Clara said. "He's already here possibly. His name is Edgar Calloway. He's a railroad investor from New York, and he has a great deal of money and a very smooth way of talking, and he is going to tell people in this town that I am unstable, dishonest, and dangerous." She held Webb's gaze without flinching. "I want you to know why before he gets to you." Webb crossed his arms. "I'm listening." So she told him. All of it. The same way she'd told Wyatt plainly, without embellishment, without the careful omissions she'd spent years using to make the story more survivable. She told him about her parents dying, and about learning horses, and about what she could do, and about Edgar Calloway deciding it was something he was entitled to own. She told him about the positions she'd lost one after another, each one arriving with a letter already ahead of her. She told him about the correspondence agency, and the train west, and the worn gray coat she'd been wearing in July heat because she'd left New York so fast she'd packed wrong. When she finished, Webb was quiet for a long moment. "He write you," he said finally. "A letter, 3 weeks ago." "And now he's in town." "Yes." Webb uncrossed his arms. He looked out across his property for a moment, the way men do when they're thinking and they need somewhere to put their eyes. Then he looked back at her. "Mrs. Granger," he said, "I watched that stallion walk to you like you were the only solid thing in the world. I've had horses 30 years, and I know what fear looks like in an animal. And I know what it looks like when an animal decides to trust something it has no rational reason to trust." He paused. "Man who'd try to own that and use it to impress people at dinner parties is a particular kind of fool." Clara said nothing. "I'll tell you what," Webb said. "You let me know if anyone comes asking questions about you that seem like they're coming from the wrong direction. I've got enough respect in this county that my answer to those questions will carry some weight." She drove back to the ranch with both hands loose on the reins and something in her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. She talked to 4 more people in the following week. Pastor Hollis, who listened with his hands folded and his face very still, and who at the end said without hesitation, "That man will find no ally in this church." Dorothy Fenwick at the Mercantile, who was the center of every conversation in Silver Creek, and who listened with sharp, intelligent eyes and said, "I've seen his type before, honey, and I've never liked them." Tom Greer, the town's only lawyer who went to a cabinet and pulled out a pad of paper and started taking notes before she'd finished her 3rd sentence. And old Mabel Hutchins, who was 81 years old and had lived in Silver Creek since before the railroad came, and who said when Clara was done, "Child, a man who tries to silence a woman because she won't belong to him is just a coward in expensive clothes." Wyatt heard about all of it from Pete, who heard it from the feed store, which meant the whole town already knew which was exactly what Clara had wanted. "You could have told me yourself," he said that evening. Not accusatory, just noting it. "I could have," she agreed. "But you didn't." "No." She set supper on the table. "You would have wanted to come and I needed to do it alone." He sat down. "How'd it go?" "Webb's on our side. Hollis, Dorothy Fenwick, Greer." She sat across from him. "Mabel Hutchins called him a coward in expensive clothes." Despite everything, Wyatt almost smiled. "Mabel Hutchins has never been wrong about anything in living memory." "That's what Dorothy told me." Clara picked up her fork. She was eating more now. He noticed that the way he'd been noticing everything quietly, without comment, just cataloging it the way you catalog good weather. Wyatt, he's going to come. Probably soon. He didn't write that letter as a courtesy, he wrote it because he wanted me to be afraid before he arrived. She paused. And I want to be ready. You are ready, Wyatt said. She looked at him. You don't know that. You just spent a week talking to 5 people you barely know about the worst years of your life, he said. If that's not ready, I don't know what is. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, I'm still afraid. I know. He held her gaze. That's different from not being ready. Edgar Calloway walked into Wyatt Granger's ranch on a Friday morning, and he did it the way men like him did everything, with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never had a door closed in their face, and had therefore never learned to consider the possibility. He was exactly what his letter had suggested. Impeccably dressed for a man in Colorado. Handsome in a careful, maintained way that took effort and money. He had a handshake that was practiced and firm and communicated very deliberately. I am a man you should take seriously. Wyatt shook his hand and said nothing. Mr. Granger. Calloway looked around the yard with the polite interest of a man assessing something he was considering purchasing. Impressive property. Good elevation. Though I imagine the winters are something. They are, Wyatt said. I'll get to the point if you don't mind. Calloway smiled. It was a smooth smile, thoroughly rehearsed. I'm here about your wife, I assumed. The smile held. You seem like a reasonable man. I appreciate that. I'll be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty. A pause timed for effect, Wyatt noticed. Clara Whitmore is not what she presented herself as. I have known her for some years, and I have watched her with deep personal concern, I assure you, cause considerable difficulty for people around her. He folded his hands. Her ability with horses sounds impressive, but it comes with a temperament that is frankly unpredictable. There were incidents in New York, serious ones. Employers who will attest. Those employers, Wyatt said, signed letters you paid for. The smile went very still. I'm sorry, Calloway said. You heard me? Wyatt's voice didn't change. It stayed flat, and even the same tone he used for everything, because he'd found that tone unnerved people more than shouting. You blackmailed 3 of her employers. You spread lies about her character because she wouldn't marry you. And now you've come here because you can't stand that she found somewhere you couldn't reach. He looked at the man across his fence. I'm telling you this so we understand each other clearly before this conversation goes any further. Calloway looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalibration. He'd expected nervous. He'd expected uncertain. He'd been preparing for a man who could be managed. He'd gotten something else entirely. Mr. Granger. He said, his voice carrying a new edge beneath the smoothness. Now, I think you've been given a particular account of events that... I've been given her account, Wyatt said. And I've watched her work. And I've talked to enough people to know what kind of woman she is. He paused. I'm going to ask you to leave my property. Calloway didn't move. I wonder if you'd reconsider that before... I'm going to ask you once more. I have a business proposal, Calloway said, and his voice dropped into something quieter, more deliberate. A serious one. I'm prepared to be very generous, Mr. Granger. Debt is a difficult thing on a ranch this size, and I've done some research on your situation. He reached into his coat. Put that away, Wyatt said. I haven't even... Put it away. Flat. Final. There is no number. There is no proposal. This conversation is over. Calloway's hand stilled inside his coat. He looked at Wyatt, really looked at him for the first time the way a man looks at something when he realizes he misjudged its weight. You'll regret this, he said. Not loudly, not theatrically, just plainly the way people say true things. Maybe, Wyatt said, but not today. Calloway left. He took his time about it, which was its own message, a reminder that leaving was his choice, not an eviction. His buggy rolled out of the yard, and Pete Hadley watched it go from the barn door and when it was out of sight, he walked over to Wyatt and stood beside him and said, "Well." "Well," Wyatt agreed. "He'll be back." "Yes." "In a different form," Pete said. "Men like that don't take no for an answer. They just take it as information about which door to try next." Wyatt looked at the road where the buggy had been. "Then we make sure all the doors are closed." The doors were not all closed. The first crack showed 3 days later when the Hendersons stopped bringing their horses to Clara's sessions. No explanation, no message, just they stopped coming. And when Wyatt ran into Ed Henderson at the feed store, Henderson met his eyes for exactly as long as it took to be polite, and then found something very important to look at on the other side of the room. The second crack was Dorothy Fenwick. Clara had walked into the mercantile on a Thursday afternoon for flour and salt and a spool of thread, and Dorothy had been at the counter with 2 women Clara didn't know well, wives of mine investors who'd arrived in Silver Creek the previous spring with money and opinions. One of them looked at Clara when she came in and said something very quietly to the other one, and both of them went very still in the specific way of people who have been mid-conversation about a subject that has just walked through the door. Dorothy caught it. She said clearly to Clara, "Come on back, honey. I've got your order half ready." But Clara had already seen it. She said nothing on the way home. She sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and looked at the road and was very quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. This was tight. This was controlled. This was the old quiet she'd had when she stepped off the stage in her gray coat and her arms wrapped around that package. "Clara," Wyatt said. "He's been busy," she said, flat. "The Hendersons aren't the backbone of this county. No, but they're the beginning." She turned her head and looked at him with an expression that was so carefully leveled, so thoroughly managed that it hurt a little to look at. "Wyatt, I knew this would happen. I told you he was patient. He doesn't come at things directly, he works at the edges. He finds the people who are already uncertain, and he gives them a reason to choose certainty on his side." She looked back at the road. "The mine investors' wives. The men at the saloon who don't know me. The ones who think a woman who can calm horses is already a little suspicious." A pause. He knows exactly where to push. Wyatt's hands were tight on the reins, tighter than necessary. "Tom Greer," he said. "What did Greer say when you talked to him?" "He said he could investigate. If there was evidence of active slander of financial coercion, there might be legal grounds." She paused. "He also said it would take time, and Calloway had resources, and time is not on our side right now." "No," she said. "It isn't." They drove in silence for a moment. "The auction," Wyatt said. Clara looked at him. "What about it?" "Webb's annual horse auction. 3 weeks. Every rancher in the county comes. Buyers from Denver, buyers from Kansas City. Half the businessmen in Silver Creek." He paused. "Webb told me this morning he's bringing 6 horses he wants you to assess before the sale." "I know. Every person who matters in this county will be in one place, including the ones Calloway has been working on." He glanced at her. "And Calloway will be there too. Men like that don't miss something like that, too much money in the room." Clara was quiet, turning it over. "You're saying, let it happen in public," she said. "I'm saying don't hide from it." He looked at her. "Whatever he's told people about you, the answer to it is showing people who you are. Not arguing, not defending, showing." He paused. "You've been doing it for months. You just need to do it where enough people can see." She looked at her hands. "Wyatt." Her voice dropped. "What if it doesn't work? What if people have already made up their minds and nothing I do?" "Some will have," he said. "That's going to be true regardless of what you do next." He looked at her. "The question is whether the ones who haven't made up their minds yet see the real thing or his version of it." Clara said nothing. "Clara." His voice was quieter now. "I have not seen you back away from one difficult thing since you arrived at this ranch. Not once." He paused. "Don't start now because of him." She looked at him. The expression on her face was unguarded in a way it hadn't been in the first weeks. Not the careful managed look, but something more raw, more real, the look of a person choosing something that cost them. "I'm frightened," she said. "I know. Not of him." She held his gaze. "Of—" She stopped. "Of it not being enough. Of having built something here and having it taken apart and—" She stopped again, looked away. "I've started to care about this place. About—" She didn't finish the sentence. Wyatt didn't push it. He let the road move under them, and the mountains stand where they'd always stood, and the silence be the kind of silence that held something without pressing it. After a while he said, "For what it's worth. Whatever happens at that auction, whatever Calloway does or says or buys his way into." He looked at the road. "This ranch is still here. Your shelf is still there. That journal's still on it." A pause. "And I'm not offering you a train ticket." Clara looked at him sharply. "I told you the first day," he said, "that I'd put you on a train if you wanted to go. That was then." He met her eyes for just a moment. "That offer's closed." Clara stared at him. "You're not going anywhere," he said, simply, completely. "Not because of him." She turned away and looked at the road. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, and she was doing the thing she did when she was feeling something she didn't yet know what to do with, holding it very still and waiting to see if it was safe. Pete Hadley would have broken the tension with a biscuit comment. There was no Pete Hadley on the wagon, so Clara sat with it. And Wyatt let her. And somewhere behind them, getting smaller with every mile, was Edgar Calloway in his hotel room or his rented office, working his patient methodical damage. Writing letters. Buying drinks. Leaning toward uncertain men with his smooth smile and his rehearsed concern and his very deliberate version of a woman who did not exist. He had done this before. He was good at it. What he did not know, what he had not yet understood about Silver Creek, about the specific way 3 months of visible daily honest work could settle into a community like roots into soil, was that the story had already been told. Not in letters, not in careful arguments, not in anything that required a lawyer or a meeting or a vote. In a horse walking across a pen. In a woman standing between a child and a rearing stallion without blinking. In a jar of preserved peaches placed on a table without conditions. In all the small, true, unshoutable things that a person does when they're not trying to be seen, that are seen anyway by the people who are paying attention. But Clara didn't know yet how many people had been paying attention. She was about to find out. It was Pete who came to the barn 3 days later with a piece of news that changed the shape of everything. He found Clara working with a young mare, that Tom Greer's wife had brought in a horse that flinched from ropes and had to be approached in a particular sideways manner that Clara had worked out in the first session. He stood at the rail and waited until she looked up. "Fella at the saloon last night," he said. "One of the railroad surveyors, been in town 2 weeks. Heard Calloway talking to the mine investors at the hotel. Heard him offer them something." He paused. "Ranch land. At low price. Said he had a contact in the county land office who could facilitate a review of certain property boundaries." Clara went very still. "Property boundaries," she repeated. "Your property boundaries," Pete said. "Specifically." The mare shifted under Clara's hand, and she automatically steadied her because her hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her had gone cold. "He's going to try to take the ranch," she said. Not a question. "Sounds like he's going to try to take something," Pete said. "Whether it's you or this land, or both, hard to say exactly. But the surveyor was bothered enough he told Greer about it this morning." Clara looked at the mare. Her hands were steady. She was not going to let them shake. "Where's Wyatt?" she said. "Fixing the north fence." Pete paused. "Want me to get him?" "No." She passed the mare's lead to Pete. "I'll go." She found Wyatt at the north fence, and she told him everything in plain sentences, in the order it happened, without softening any of it. She watched his face go still, and then go hard in a way she'd seen only once before, when she'd told him what Edgar had done to her in New York. That particular hardness, not anger exactly, but something colder, something with depth and patience to it, was more frightening and more reassuring than anger would have been. "Land fraud," he said. "That's what it sounds like." He set the fence tool down. "Clara, if he has a contact in the land office, if there's paperwork being moved around—" "I know." She held his gaze. "Wyatt, this isn't just about me anymore." "It never was just about you," he said. He said it without any sense of blame, just fact. "I brought this here," she said. "He followed me here and now he's—" "Stop." His voice was firm. "He chose to follow you. He chose to come after this ranch. That's his doing, not yours." He picked up the fence tool. "Get Tom Greer. Tell him to meet us tonight, and tell him to bring everything he's heard." "And the auction," she said. "That's in 2 weeks." Wyatt looked at her. 2 weeks, he said, is enough time. He didn't explain what he meant by that. He didn't have to. Because Clara Granger, who had once been Clara Whitmore, who had carried a locked package for 12 years and spent 3 years being systematically dismantled by a patient, wealthy man, had started to understand something about the man she'd married. Wyatt Granger was not impulsive. He was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice or make speeches or threaten. He watched. And when he knew enough, he moved. And whatever he was watching right now, whatever he was putting together in the quiet of that particular look on his face, she trusted it with a certainty that was entirely new to her, that felt like standing on ground she hadn't tested yet and finding it solid under her feet. She went to get Tom Greer, and behind her, Wyatt Granger stood at the north fence and looked out at his land, the land that a man with money and connections was already drawing lines around, and his hands were very still, and his face was very quiet, and he was thinking. 2 weeks. Tom Greer arrived at the ranch before supper and stayed past midnight. He spread his papers across Wyatt's kitchen table with the focused efficiency of a man who had been thinking hard about this since the surveyor found him that morning, and he went through it methodically. What the surveyor had overheard, what it suggested about Calloway's contact in the land office, what legal remedies existed, and how fast they could move, and what the realistic picture looked like if they couldn't move fast enough. The realistic picture was not good. "He doesn't need to win in court," Greer said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "He just needs to create enough confusion about your title that buyers get nervous, lenders get nervous, and the practical reality of running this ranch becomes untenable." He looked at Wyatt. "It's a pressure tactic. He's done it before. I found 2 cases in Denver, same pattern. He doesn't take land. He makes land too expensive to keep. And the owner sells at a loss," Wyatt said, "to whoever's offering, often to one of Calloway's associates at a price well below value." Greer paused. "Your title is clean, Wyatt. I checked. But clean titles can still be buried under enough paperwork to make a man miserable for 2 or 3 years. Clara, who had been sitting at the end of the table with her hands around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, said the land isn't the real goal. Both men looked at her. "It's leverage," she said. "If the ranch is threatened, Wyatt has to choose between fighting for the land and me." She looked at Greer. "Edgar knows a man can't do both at once. Not with limited resources." Her voice stayed even. "He's trying to create a situation where I become the problem, where the simplest solution is to remove me." Greer said nothing for a moment, then, "That's a very clear-eyed read of the situation." "I've had 3 years to learn how he thinks," she said. Wyatt, who had not taken his eyes off Clara since she'd said it, said, "What do we need from the land office to cut this off before it starts?" "The name of his contact," Greer said. "1 piece of correspondence. 1 record of payment. Anything that shows the boundary review was initiated by Calloway rather than by the county." He tapped the table. "If I can show that I can stop it in its tracks and potentially get him on fraud charges that follow him back to Denver and further." "How do you get that?" Clara said. Greer looked at his papers. "Carefully," he said, "and quickly." They talked for another 2 hours. When Greer finally left carrying his papers and a new list of names to speak to in the morning, the kitchen was quiet, in the particular way it gets when something has been decided, when the talking is over, and what remains is just the weight of it sitting in the room. Clara picked up the coffee cups and carried them to the basin. Wyatt watched her from the table. "Clara," he said. "I know what you're going to say," she said without turning around. "Do you?" "You're going to say it's not my fault, and I shouldn't feel responsible for what he's doing to your land." She set the cups down. "And you'd be right, factually." She turned. "But Wyatt, he followed me here. He chose this ranch because I'm in it." She held his gaze. "I can know it's not my fault and still feel the weight of it. Both of those things are true." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Then feel the weight of it." He stood up. "And then help me stop him. Because feeling it and being stopped by it are two different things, and you know the difference." She looked at him. "I do know the difference," she said quietly. "Then get some sleep," he said. "We have an auction to prepare for." The 2 weeks moved fast and slow, at the same time, the way time moves when you're waiting for something inevitable crawling in the quiet moments, and then suddenly gone in the busy ones. Greer moved carefully through the land office, talking to people he trusted, looking for the thread that would unravel Calloway's contact. He found partial evidence, a record of a meeting that shouldn't have happened, a signature on a document that predated the formal request for review by 3 weeks, but not enough yet. Not the clean, undeniable piece that would close the door completely. Calloway, meanwhile, continued his patient work through Silver Creek. He bought drinks at the saloon. He attended church with an expression of deep respectability. He had conversations at the hotel with the mine investors that nobody could quite hear, but that left men looking thoughtful in Clara's direction when she passed them on the street. He never said anything that could be directly reported, nothing that could be quoted and confronted. He was too good for that. But Clara felt the shift. The way people hesitated half a beat before greeting her. The way conversations changed shape when she walked into a room. The way Mrs. Fenwick at the Mercantile was warm but careful. Warm but watching as if she were holding her opinion in trust until something final decided it. She kept working, every day without exception. The horses came and she worked with them, and she was good at it, better if anything under pressure, because pressure had a way of clarifying things down to what was real. She worked with a damaged roan that had been mishandled badly and came to her wild-eyed and shaking. She worked with a young quarter horse that Harrison Webb wanted ready for the auction. She worked with an old draft horse that didn't need calming so much as it needed someone to stand beside it and confirm that it hadn't been forgotten. She knew people were watching. She worked as if they weren't. The morning of Webb's auction, Pete Hadley appeared at the barn before sunrise with coffee and an expression that meant he had something to say and was working up to it. "Out with it, Pete," Clara said, not looking up from the bridle she was checking. "People are going to look at you funny today," he said. "They've been looking at me funny for 2 weeks. Funny in a different way," he said. "Calloway's been busy. Heard some things last night at the saloon that—" He paused. "It's going to be a harder room than you might be expecting." Clara looked up. "How hard?" Pete considered. "Some people have decided, not all of them in your direction." She held his gaze. "And the others?" "The others are watching," he said, like they're waiting for something to make it plain. She went back to the bridle. "Then something will make it plain." Pete drank his coffee. "You're not as scared as I'd expect a person to be." "I'm terrified," she said. "I'm just not stopping." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something satisfied him. "All right then." Webb's auction ground was the biggest gathering Clara had seen since arriving in Colorado. Ranchers from 3 counties, buyers from Denver and Kansas City, townspeople who came for the spectacle of it. Children running between legs, the particular noise of 100 conversations, and the movement of horses, and the smell of good animals and nervous humans all in the same space. Wyatt stayed close without hovering. He had a way of being beside her that took up no room, didn't crowd her, didn't speak for her, just existed in the peripheral space where she knew he was there. She saw Calloway within the first 10 minutes. He was standing with two of the mine investors and a man she didn't recognize in an expensive coat, and he saw her at almost the same moment she saw him. He smiled slowly and inclined his head in a greeting that was also a message. "I see you. I'm still here. This is not over." She looked away first deliberately, as if he weren't worth the attention. She went to find Harrison Webb. The auction moved through the morning with its own momentum. Animals presented bids called arguments over quality and price, conducted in the enthusiastic shorthand of men who'd been doing this for years. Clara worked her way through Webb's animals in the holding pen, assessing each one, making notes in her mother's journal that she'd started carrying in her apron pocket, and she did it with the complete, focused attention she always gave to animals in her care. Oblivious, apparently, to the watching. Completely present. It was a gray gelding that started it. Webb had pulled him from the auction list the previous week, a 3-year-old that had come off a bad transport and had been deteriorating ever since, growing more unreachable by the day. He'd told Clara about him, and she'd spent 4 sessions with him, and the progress had been real but incomplete, and she'd told Webb honestly that the horse wasn't ready to be sold. She hadn't expected Webb to bring him to the auction. "Thought it might be useful," Webb said, appearing beside her with his arms crossed. "For people to see." She looked at him. "You planned this?" "Might have mentioned it to Hollis and Greer and Mabel Hutchins," he admitted. "Might have mentioned it to a few others. Asked them to be nearby when I brought him out." Clara looked at the gelding. He was at the far end of the holding pen, head-high body, tight with the particular tension of an animal that had stopped trusting the world. The crowd that had drifted toward the pen was keeping its distance. "He's not ready," she said. "You'll make him ready," Webb said. He was not asking. She looked at the gathered crowd, the ranchers and buyers and townspeople and mine investors, and one man in an expensive coat who had just appeared at the edge of the pen with his smooth smile and his calculating eyes, and she thought about Pete saying the others are watching, like they're waiting for something to make it plain. She handed Webb her jacket. "Keep people back," she said. "No loud noises, no sudden movement." She went into the pen. The crowd went quiet in stages the way a large group does when something is happening that demands attention. First the people closest, then spreading outward as others noticed the quiet and turned to see its cause. The gelding registered her immediately, his whole body oriented toward her like a compass needle finding north, not toward safety, not yet, but toward the one thing in this space that wasn't threatening him. He was shaking. She could see it from 12 feet away, the fine tremor that ran through him like current. She stopped. She let him have the distance. She stood with her hands at her sides and waited. Around the pen nobody moved. She could hear Calloway somewhere behind her saying something low to the investor beside him, presumably something dry and dismissive. But she let it go past her because it didn't matter. None of it mattered except what was in front of her. This frightened animal that needed someone to hold still long enough to be trusted. The gelding took 1 step toward her, then stopped. She waited. 2 steps. Stopped again. The crowd was completely silent now. Not the silence of boredom, the silence of people holding their breath. She heard a child somewhere say in a stage whisper that carried further than intended, "What's she doing?" And a woman's voice shushing. And nothing else. The horse came to her, not dramatically, not in a rush. He walked toward her the way you walk toward something you've decided finally to believe in, 1 step at a time, testing the ground until he was close enough and she could bring both hands up and place them against the side of his face and feel the shaking move through her palms, and then gradually, impossibly, begin to still. "There," she said softly. "Right there. That's all. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." He exhaled, long and deep and shuddering, like releasing something he'd been carrying since before she met him. Behind her, somebody in the crowd made a sound, not words. Just a sound, the kind that comes out of people when they see something they weren't prepared for. It rippled through the gathered crowd and didn't stop. Webb said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That horse has not let a human being touch him in 6 weeks. 3 experienced handlers tried. This is the first time he's stood still in this county." A pause. "Clara Granger has been working with him for a month." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, Mabel Hutchins' voice carrying the way very old women's voices carry when they've decided something needs to be said. "Well, I don't know what that man from New York has been telling people, but I know what I just saw with my own eyes. And I know which one of those things I trust." The laughter that followed was surprised and warm, and very much not the kind of sound Edgar Calloway had been building toward. Clara kept her hands on the horse's face and didn't turn around. What happened next, she heard about from Pete and Greer and Webb and Dorothy Fenwick, and eventually from Wyatt, each of them, with their own piece of it, assembled later into a complete picture. Calloway left the pen immediately after Mabel Hutchins spoke. Not running, he wouldn't run, that wasn't how he operated, but moving with purpose, cutting through the crowd toward the investor he'd been talking to all morning. He talked to that man for 8 minutes. She had heard that from the man's ranch hand, who had been standing behind his employer and who had heard every word. What Calloway said in those 8 minutes with the careful articulation of a man who had just watched a plan fail and was already building the next one was this: that Clara Granger's ability was not a gift. It was a trick. A performance. That she had done something to the horse beforehand, sedated it somehow, or conditioned it to respond to her presence through some kind of training that was being misrepresented. That she was a fraud and a manipulator, and Wyatt Granger was too blinded by his feelings for his wife to see it. The investor had looked at him for a long moment, and then he'd said, "Mr. Calloway, I watched that horse. My family has kept horses for 40 years. That animal was not sedated. That woman has a gift that I can't explain, and I'll be damned if I'm going to call a thing fraudulent just because I can't explain it." He'd picked up his hat. "I don't think we have any further business." That was the first piece. The second piece was Tom Greer, who had spent the auction morning not watching horses, but watching the land office clerk who had appeared at the auction, a man named Sutter, who had no reason to be at a horse auction, and who had headed directly to Calloway upon arrival. Greer had seen the exchange. He hadn't heard it. But he'd followed Sutter afterward, and what he found in a conversation he managed to insert himself into with the particular social agility of a lawyer who had grown up in this town was something very useful. Sutter was scared, not of Calloway specifically, but of what Calloway had told him to do and what it meant if anyone found out. He was a man who had made one bad decision for money and had woken up inside it to find it larger than he'd expected. Greer recognized that look. He'd seen it in clients for 20 years. He made Sutter an offer come forward voluntarily with documentation before Calloway could control the narrative, and Greer would argue for leniency. Wait until someone else found the evidence and he'd be on his own. Sutter had asked for 2 hours to think about it. Greer gave him one. Wyatt was at the wagon when Clara found him after the auction. He looked at her face and said, "Tell me." She told him about the gelding, about Mabel Hutchins, about the investor walking away from Calloway. She watched something ease in him that had been wound very tight for 2 weeks. "Greer found something," she said. "He wouldn't tell me the details. He said tonight. He wants to meet tonight. Then we meet tonight." Wyatt helped her up to the wagon bench. He stopped before releasing her hand. Just stopped with her hand in his, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Direct and undefended, nothing managed about it. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "I'll tell you later." She looked at his hand holding hers. She thought about all the things accumulating under the word. Later, the weight of them, the shape of them, the particular patience of 2 people who were still learning what they were to each other. "All right," she said. He released her hand and climbed up beside her. They drove home in the late afternoon light, both of them quiet with things they were not quite saying. yet both of them carrying the specific relief of a day that had gone as well as it could go, and both of them in the back of whatever they were feeling, knowing something else was still coming. It came at 2 in the morning 3 days later, with the sound of horses and the smell of smoke. Clara woke first. She always woke first, a habit from years of sleeping in places where danger arrived without announcement. She woke from a dead sleep to the smell of kerosene and the sound of voices she didn't recognize, and she was on her feet before she'd fully assembled the world around her. She went to the window, and what she saw sent ice straight through her chest. 3 men with lanterns at the barn door. One of them with a can that caught the light, wrong too wet, too heavy, the kind of wrong that meant something terrible. And beyond them, at the fence line, a 4th figure standing apart from the others, with the patient stillness of a man who was overseeing rather than doing. Calloway. She did not waste time on the fear. She let it arrive, and she stepped past it in the same motion, the way she stepped past it with frightened horses, acknowledging it not becoming it. She did not go to Wyatt first. She went to the barn. She went through the side door, the one facing away from where the men were, and she moved through the dark interior with the certainty of someone who had learned this space in daylight and carried it in her body now. The horses knew her before she reached them. They were already moving, already sensing the wrong in the air, and she spoke to them low and constant as she unlatched each stall one after another, moving fast. "Come on," she said each time. "Come on, come now, this way, keep moving." They trusted her enough to go, all 8 of them out through the far side door into the open dark of the north pasture. She turned them loose and slapped the last one on the rump and said, "Go." And they went. Then she ran. She ran for the house because the men at the barn had the kerosene, and she had 30 seconds, maybe less, before they stopped talking and started moving, and Wyatt was inside, and he didn't know. She didn't knock. She shoved the bedroom door open and said flat and fast, "Calloway, 3 men, barn, kerosene. The horses are out. Get your rifle." Wyatt was already sitting up. He was off the bed in 4 seconds. Rifle in hand in 6. He looked at her once, just long enough, and said, "You got the horses out." All 8. Something moved in his face. Then he was past her and down the hall and out the back door, and she was right behind him. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not clean, and it was not quiet, and it was not the kind of thing that got told the same way by everyone who described it afterward. What was certain, Wyatt came around the corner of the barn at the same moment the first lantern dropped, and the fire that had started at the base of the door was 3 feet wide and growing, and the man with the kerosene can turned and ran directly into Pete Hadley, who had come out of the bunkhouse at the first sound of horses moving, and who was built like a fence post, and had the reflexes of a younger man when something threatened the animals in his care. One man ran, one man fought and lost, one man stood with his hands up and his face completely white, and Edgar Calloway at the fence line turned to find Wyatt between him and the road. The fire was out in minutes, Clara, with the water bucket from the trough. Pete's blanket, the ground still wet from 2 days of rain. The barn door was scorched but standing. The horses were safe in the north pasture, moving as a group in the dark, unsettled but unharmed. All of this happened fast. What happened slowly was Wyatt and Calloway at the fence line. Clara saw Wyatt's face when he found out, not at the fence, but after, when Greer arrived with the sheriff 20 minutes later, called by Pete, who'd sent a hand into town at the first alarm. Greer told Wyatt then, with the efficiency of a man who had been awake all night processing what Sutter had signed before midnight, what Calloway had done to Clara before she ever set foot in Colorado. Not the version Clara had told Greer had documentation now. Letters, payment records, a signed statement from Sutter, and 3 names in New York who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity to say, under legal protection, what Edgar Calloway had done to their employee's reputation and livelihood and life. Wyatt's face went through several things in the space of 30 seconds. Clara, standing 3 feet away, watched him get there. She said, "Wyatt." His jaw was tight enough to see in the dark. "Wyatt." She stepped in front of him, directly between him and where Calloway stood with the sheriff. "Look at me." He looked at her. "He is not worth it," she said. Her voice was low and completely certain. Not your hands, not your name, not one more thing that he gets to take from either of us. She held his gaze. He's done. Greer has it. The sheriff has it. It's finished. Wyatt looked at her for a long time. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the effort of deciding. Clara, he said very quietly, do you know what he did to you? All of it. What Greer just... I know what he did to me, she said. I lived it. She didn't look away from him. And I am still here. I am standing in front of you on my land in my home, with my horses in that pasture, and none of that happened because I let him make me into something destroyed. She stepped closer. Don't let him do it to you. Not now. Not when it's over. The shaking in his hands slowed. Stopped. He took one breath, and then another. And then he looked over her shoulder at Edgar Calloway, at the man who had tried to own something that wasn't his, who had followed that thing across a country and burned down a door to try to reclaim it. And he looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has decided someone isn't worth any more of his attention. Then he looked back at Clara. It's over, he said. It's over, she said. The sheriff put the handcuffs on Edgar Calloway at 3:40 in the morning, and Calloway said nothing. He had the look of a man recalculating still working angles, still somewhere behind his eyes, finding a way to spin this, but there were no angles left. Sutter's testimony, combined with 3 New York witnesses and the evidence of what had happened tonight on Wyatt's land, was the kind of wall that money could only soften, not knock down. Tom Greer, who had been up for 19 hours and had the appearance of a man who was powered entirely by the satisfaction of a thing correctly done, shook Wyatt's hand and said, We'll want you and Clara in my office Monday morning. But Wyatt, it's solid. It's very solid. Wyatt nodded. After Greer left, after the sheriff's wagon rolled away with Calloway and 2 of his men, after Pete Hadley had walked the perimeter twice and checked every latch and bolt with the thoroughness of a man who was going to be very certain before he slept again. After all of it, Wyatt and Clara stood in the yard in the dark and the quiet of 2 in the morning. The fire smell had mostly gone. The horses would need to be brought in from the north pasture in a few hours. The barn door would need work in the morning. None of that mattered right now. Wyatt looked at his wife. She was in her nightclothes with her hair loose and her feet in her work boots, which she'd put on in the dark without laces, and she had soot on her left hand from the fire and something in her face that he had never seen before. Not the careful composure, not the managed steadiness, not the armor, but something underneath all of that, something open and exhausted and completely entirely real. He said, That thing I said I'd tell you later. She looked at him. I think I should tell you now, he said. Clara waited. Wyatt, who was not a man who spoke easily about what he felt, who communicated mostly in steadiness and presence, and the language of people who have learned that actions mean more than words, stood in the dark with the smoke smell still in the air, and the horses moving in the north pasture, and said plainly without ceremony, I am grateful every single day that you stepped off that stage. Clara looked at him for a long time. The night was very still around them. Wyatt, she said, and her voice was not steady, not this time, not even a little. I think I need to tell you something too. I think I need to tell you something too. She said it the way she said everything that mattered quietly, directly, without preamble, and then she stopped, because the words that came next were ones she had not said to another person in so long that she'd half convinced herself she'd forgotten how. Wyatt waited. He was very good at waiting. When I wrote that first letter, Clara said, I told you I wasn't looking for rescue. I meant it. I wasn't. I was looking for ground that was fair, and work that was honest, and a life that belonged to me. She looked at him. I didn't expect you. Me specifically, he said. You specifically. She held his gaze in the dark. I didn't expect someone who noticed how much I ate and put preserves on the table without making it mean anything. I didn't expect someone who stood at a gate while I walked toward a horse that had broken 3 men's arms and trusted me to know what I was doing. Her voice was steady, but just barely. I didn't expect someone who told me this was my home, and meant it down to the bone. "Clara, let me finish," she said. "I've been carrying this for a while and I'd like to put it down." She took one breath. "I love you, Wyatt. I don't know exactly when it happened. I know it was before the auction, and I suspect it was before the stallion, and it might have been as early as the night you put those preserves on the table and told Pete Hadley they were tomorrow's breakfast." She paused. "I wanted you to know that. Not because of what just happened tonight, or because I'm frightened, or because I need you to say it back. Just because it's true, and you deserve to hear true things." The yard was very still. Wyatt looked at his wife, at this woman who had stepped off a stagecoach like someone calculating exits, who had carried a locked package for 12 years, who had just run barefoot through a burning barn to save 8 horses, and then stood between him and the worst decision he'd have ever made. And he said in the quiet way that meant he'd been thinking it long enough that saying it was just finishing a sentence. "I've known since the Black Stallion," he said, "watching you stand there with both hands out and not 1 ounce of fear on your face." He paused. "I've known since then. I just didn't have the right to say it yet." "You have the right now," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you, Clara. Every single part of what you are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." And the word came out with something in it that was half laugh and half relief, and entirely her real and unmanaged, and nothing like the careful woman who had apologized for using the last of the soap. And Wyatt Granger, who was not a demonstrative man by any measure, crossed the yard and put his arms around his wife and held her simply and completely in the dark. She let herself be held. That was the thing she hadn't done. In all the surviving, all the managing, all the careful construction of a self that could withstand whatever came next, she had not let herself be held. Not in years. Maybe not ever. Not like this. She let herself be held. And the ranch was quiet around them, and the horses moved somewhere in the north pasture, and the smoke smell faded into pine and cold mountain air, and everything that needed to be said had been said. Edgar Calloway went to trial in Denver 4 months later. Tom Greer handled it with the specific satisfaction of a lawyer who had been building a case in his head since the moment a woman he'd respected on sight sat across his desk and told him a story that made his blood run cold. He brought Sutter's testimony. He brought the 3 New York witnesses, Clara's former employers, 2 of whom had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment, had been carrying what they'd done like a stone in a coat pocket for years. He brought the evidence of the attempted arson witnessed by Pete Hadley and a deputy who'd arrived in time to see Calloway standing at the fence. He brought Clara. She testified on a Tuesday morning in a Denver courtroom in a gray dress, not the worn gray coat she'd arrived in, but something clean and well-made that Dorothy Fenwick had helped her choose, and she told the court exactly what had happened to her over 3 years in plain sentences, in her precise, careful voice, without flinching once. Wyatt sat in the second row. He did not say a word the entire day. He didn't need to. He just sat there, solid as the mountains, and when Clara came off the stand and walked back to her seat, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and that was the whole conversation. Calloway's lawyer tried. He was good, expensive, and good, and he worked every angle available to him with considerable skill. He questioned Clara's credibility, her history, her mental stability. He suggested the New York witnesses had motives she hadn't disclosed. He called the arson accusation an overreach and suggested that what had happened at the barn was a misunderstanding that had been sensationalized by a small-town sheriff with limited experience. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty, on 4 of the 5 counts. Calloway stood when the verdict was read, and his face went through something just for a moment, just a flash that was almost recognizable as the face of a man who had genuinely believed he would not lose, that he had never lost, that losing was something that happened to other people. Clara watched it happen. She felt nothing she would have expected to feel. Not triumph, not release, not even the quiet satisfaction of justice correctly delivered. What she felt was simpler and stranger. She felt finished. The way a sentence feels when you put the period on it and move on to the next one. She leaned toward Wyatt and said very quietly, "Can we go home?" He was already on his feet. Hug. Silver Creek decided its opinion of Clara Granger in the weeks after the trial, and it decided it the way small towns decide most things, not in one clean moment, but in accumulated gestures, small and large and unstoppable once they'd started. Dorothy Fenwick organized a collection. Not money. Clara had been very clear that she didn't want money, but materials. Lumber, nails, fencing, wire, glass for windows. Because she had told Dorothy in passing about something she'd been thinking about. A larger space. More stalls. Room enough for the kind of work she was starting to imagine. Webb donated a section of fencing and 3 days of his ranch hand's labor. Pastor Hollis led a work party every Saturday for 6 weeks. Pete Hadley, who had never in 11 years of working for Wyatt Granger shown any particular opinion about anything, told the feed store owner that in his view, Mrs. Granger was the finest person he had encountered in 30 years of ranch work, and he dared anyone to say different. Nobody said different. What grew from all of it was not quite what any single person had planned, because it was built from too many different people's generosity to belong entirely to any one plan. But by the following spring, the Granger Ranch had a proper training facility, real stalls, proper fencing, a covered working area for bad weather, and Clara was running sessions 6 days a week with a waiting list that stretched to the following year. She hired 2 helpers. Young men, both of them, brought to her attention by Mabel Hutchins in her capacity as what Mabel Hutchins had always been, the woman in Silver Creek who knew where everyone was and what they needed before they knew it themselves. One of them was 17, orphaned by a mining accident the previous winter, who had been living at the edge of town doing odd jobs and sleeping badly. The other was 20, newly arrived from Kansas, who had grown up in a difficult home and had a way with animals that reminded Clara sharply and precisely of herself at that age. She didn't make speeches to them about what they'd find here. She just put them to work and paid them fairly and let the work teach them what the work teaches. That patience is a skill, that trust is built slowly and lost fast, that a frightened thing needs time and space and consistency, and nothing that resembles force. They were both extraordinary within a year. She told Wyatt one evening sitting on the porch in the October cool, "I think James is going to be better at this than I am." Wyatt, who had been watching the boy work all month with the same quiet attention he gave. Everything said, "I think you're right." "That doesn't bother you," she said. "To hear me say that. Why would it bother me?" She considered. "Some people don't like being surpassed." He looked at her. "I'm not some people." "No," she said. "You're not." The letter came from New York the following spring, and it came from a woman named Mary Gaines, or Mary Gaines, as she'd been, because she was someone else. Now, a different last name, a life in Wyoming, she described in the same short factual way Clara had once written letters eastward. She'd heard about the trial. Word had moved through channels that connected women who'd left difficult places for better ones, and Mary Gaines had sat down and written 3 pages in the same voice Clara remembered, plain and careful, and entirely without self-pity. At the end she wrote, "I'm glad you found ground. I heard about what you built out there. I think our mothers would have found each other if the world had let them. I think we were supposed to." Clara read the letter twice, and then she went to the barn, and she put both hands on the black stallion, who was not the wild, broken thing he'd been when he arrived, who was something different now. Something that still had depth and fire, but had learned to carry it without terror. And she stood with him for a long time, without saying anything at all. Wyatt found her there an hour later. "Letter," he said. "Mary Gaines," she said. "She's well." "Good." He came to stand beside her. He put his hand on the horse's neck the way he'd learned to do without being shown gently with respect for the animal's history. "Clara, I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "The boys who come here," he said. "The ones Mabel sends. The ones from the mining accidents. The ones from bad situations." He paused. "We've got the space. We've got more than we use." He looked at her. "What if it was more formal than it is now?" She turned her head and looked at him. "What do you mean more formal?" I mean a proper place, he said. Not just horses, people too. Boys who need somewhere to work and learn and... He stopped slightly uncharacteristically uncertain. I don't know exactly what I mean. I know it when I see it, I just can't... A sanctuary, Clara said. He looked at her. My mother used to say that the best homes aren't the ones built for beauty, she said. They're the ones built for refuge. She held his gaze. Something comes in broken and leaves healed. That's what this place already is. She paused. You want to make it what it already is on purpose. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. She looked at the stallion. She thought about Mary Gaines's letter. She thought about James, the 17-year-old orphan, who had started sleeping better since he'd started working, who had said to her last week with the kind of honesty that only comes from people who have nothing left to protect. Mrs. Granger, I never knew a place could feel like this. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. Let's build it properly, she said. Let's do it on purpose. The thing about a life Clara would come to understand is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet and a clear sense of its own significance. It builds the way good things build incrementally quietly through the accumulation of small true choices made one at a time, each one too ordinary to feel important in the moment, and only visible as significant when you turn around and look at what they've made together. She did not notice in any particular week or month that she had become someone different from the woman who stepped off that stagecoach in her worn gray coat. It happened too slowly to observe. But there was a morning she was 34, 7 years into a life she had not expected to have, when she woke before the sun and lay still for a moment, listening to Wyatt's steady breathing beside her, and the horses moving below, and the first birds somewhere in the pine ridge, and she did not automatically catalog the exits, did not calculate the distance to the door, did not do any of the things she had done every single morning for 12 years before this. She just lay there, breathing. She cried a little quietly in the dark, and when Wyatt stirred and said without quite waking, "You all right?" she said, "Yes," and meant it down to the floor of herself. The ranch changed shape over the years, the way living things do not all at once, but in responses to what it needed to become. Tom Greer helped them formalize it 2 years after Calloway's trial. Legal standing, proper documentation, a structure that protected what they'd built from the kind of interference they'd already survived once. Webb sat on the board they formed along with Hollis and Dorothy Fenwick and Mabel Hutchins, who was 83 by then, and attended every meeting with the alertness of a woman who had decided she would be present until she was not, and not a moment before. Boys came from the mining accidents. Boys came from difficult homes that Mabel's network of sharp-eyed women had identified across 3 counties. A woman came once, just once at first, brought by Dorothy Fenwick in the early morning without explanation, with nothing but a carpet bag and a careful expression that Clara recognized immediately. She stayed for 6 weeks. Then she went home, and 2 months later she came back with her daughter, and they both stayed for good. The horses came always. Damaged animals from places that had not been kind to them arriving frightened and leaving changed. Clara never stopped being the one who heard them that particular inheritance from her mother. From her mother's mother. The thing the world had spent years telling her was wrong, was suspicious, was something to be managed or exploited or owned. She carried it openly now. No apology, no careful management of how it appeared to other people. She simply was what she was, and what she was had built something that mattered. James became her partner in the work. Not her employee, her partner with all the weight that word carries. He had her gift, or something adjacent to it, something that was his own particular shape of the same truth. They worked alongside each other with the ease of people who speak the same language and have stopped needing to say so. He was better with certain horses, younger ones whose fear was still close to the surface and needed quickness. She was better with the old, deeply damaged ones, the ones that needed someone who understood what it meant to carry something for a long time before you could put it down. Wyatt built things. He was always building something, a new fence section, a stronger barn wall, a better drainage system for the winter runoff. He had a gift for the physical logic of a place, understanding what it needed structurally. The way Clara understood what animals needed emotionally, and the two of them together. The woman who heard what was inside things, and the man who built what held them, made a ranch that was by any practical measure something extraordinary. They had children. Two, a boy first, then a girl 4 years apart. Both of them born in the ranch house, and raised in the specific freedom of children who grow up in a place that takes all kinds seriously. Their son Daniel had his father's stillness and his mother's gift with animals, and a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room it was in completely. Their daughter Ruth was small and fierce, and opinionated in the particular way of people who have observed the world very carefully from a young age, and have formed their own conclusions about it, and those conclusions are not negotiable. Clara taught them both, not just horses. Everything she had learned about the difference between fear and danger, about the specific courage required to stand still in a frightening space and let a frightened thing come to you, about what trust costs and what it's worth, and why the only way to earn it is to be exactly who you say you are, consistently without exception over time. She taught them the way her mother had tried to teach her, as an inheritance, as something that belonged to them and could not be taken. The winter that Daniel turned 12, he came to his mother in the barn one afternoon, with a particular expression on his face, the look of a child who has encountered something he doesn't have words for yet and is waiting for someone to give them to him. "Mama," he said, "that new horse, the gray one, she's not mean." "No," Clara said, "she's not. She's scared." "Yes." He looked at the horse and then back at his mother. "How do you know the difference between mean and scared?" Clara looked at her son, at Wyatt's eyes in her face, at the set of her own jaw in his. At 12 years old, and already watching the world the way people watch it when they intend to understand it. "Mean wants to hurt you," she said. "Scared just doesn't want to be hurt anymore." She paused. "Most things that look mean are scared. Not all of them, but most." Daniel considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "What do you do with the ones that are scared?" he said. "You give them time," she said. "And space. And you don't flinch. And you let them decide when they're ready." She looked at him. "And you don't take it personally if they're not ready yet. It's not about you." He nodded slowly. Then he went to the fence of the gray mare's pen and stood there, hands at his sides, patient as a Sunday morning. Clara watched him for a long moment. Then she went to find Wyatt. She found him at the north fence. Always the north fence. That fence required more maintenance than made any rational sense, and Wyatt remained committed to it with the loyalty of a man who has decided some fights are worth having on principle. She came and stood beside him, and he looked up and saw her face. "What?" he said. "Daniel's working the gray?" she said. Wyatt looked toward the barn, his hands stilled on the fence wire. "He's standing there like you do," Clara said. "Just waiting, hands loose, not pushing." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. "He's 12, he said. "I know." "He's going to be—" He stopped. "I know," she said again. They stood there together, and the wind came off the mountain, the way it always did in the afternoons, and somewhere in the barn, their son was standing at a fence, with his hands at his sides, inheriting something without knowing. That's what was happening, and the ranch spread out around them in all directions, the pastures and the buildings and the people moving through them, James, with a young horse in the far pen, two of the current boys carrying water from the pump. Ruth's voice somewhere in the house, asking her father a question he wasn't there to answer. "Wyatt," Clara said. Are you happy?" He looked at her. It was not a question she'd asked him before, not directly. Not like that, plain and open, the way she asked things, now that she'd learned asking directly cost less than the weight of not asking. He looked at her for a long time. At his wife of 12 years, who had stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a locked package and a worn gray coat, and a gift the world had spent years trying to take from her. who had stood her ground in every form that required standing against fear, against cruelty, against the particular corrosion of years spent being told you are less than you are. Who had built something here from broken ground and difficult beginnings that was more real and more lasting than anything he had dreamed of when he was a lonely man staring at a telegram on a kitchen table. "Yes," he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd known and wanted to hear anyway. "Good," she said, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she'd learned to lean with her full weight without apology, without calculating in advance whether the ground would hold. It held. It always held. Years later, many years enough that the ranch had become the kind of place people in 3 counties told stories about enough that children had grown, and the first grandchildren had arrived, and Mabel Hutchins had finally at 91 decided she was done attending meetings. An elderly Wyatt Granger sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, with his wife beside him, their hands interlocked, the way they'd been interlocking for decades, easy and certain, and completely without effort. He watched their granddaughter run across the yard below Daniel's oldest 5 years old, and already fearless in the specific way of children raised on this land, and he thought about a telegram on a kitchen table. About a choice made without quite knowing what it was choosing. About a woman who had arrived like a warning and turned out to be the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. He turned his head and looked at Clara. She was watching their granddaughter, and there was something in her face that was so complete, so entirely without the old armor that it still moved him after all these years, the fact of her peace, the fact that she had built her way to it and claimed it and kept it. "Clara," he said. She turned. "You thought your gift was calming horses," he said. "That thing you inherited, the listening." She looked at him with the patience of a woman who has learned that when Wyatt takes this long to say something, it is worth hearing. "Your real gift," he said quietly, "was teaching broken things they could feel safe again." He held her gaze. "Every person on this land, every animal that came here frightened, every child Mabel sent us that didn't know where else to go." He paused. "You did that. You built that." He tightened his hand around hers. "That's what you made with your life, Clara. That's what you are." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright the way they got when something hit the center of her. "We," she said. "That's what we made." He nodded. "We." She turned back to watch their granddaughter, and Wyatt watched Clara, and the light moved across the Colorado mountains, the way it had moved across them every evening for 30 years of sunsets they had sat here and witnessed together. The frightened mail-order bride who had once arrived clutching a locked package she hadn't yet earned the safety to open, had opened it finally on a ranch at the edge of the mountains. Not just her mother's journal, but everything it had promised. Every generation of women who had carried a quiet gift in a world too small to hold it. Every inheritance of patience and compassion and the fierce, unshakable belief that broken things were worth the time it took to heal them. She had opened all of it. And what grew from it, the ranch, the family, the generations of people and animals who had found their way through that gate and left less frightened than they'd arrived, did not belong to one woman's gift, or one man's steadiness, or any single choice made in any single year. It belonged to what they had chosen every day together. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was in every sense of the word that mattered everything.